us the bread of life, which we have heard about all this week, and how thrilling it is to hear it once again. We thank you and we praise you now and forever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I am Deacon Mike Medley. I'm from St. Paul, Minneapolis Archdiocese. I was ordained in the year 2000 with 11 other men. All of us were married. That's not often the case. If you are married, you can remain married, obviously, but if you're not married, you may not marry after your ordination, similar to the priest. We come down here for 4 months out of the year, and my son, Father Sam, often calls me the day before, says, will you do a talk, which he did last night. We were watching The Chosen, if any of you have seen that. It's a beautiful show. We were watching The Chosen. I said, well, I'll answer them later, and my wife in the back there said, you better answer them now. I think this is kind of important. So last night he said, just do a talk, do it on the Shroud of Turin. He didn't tell me that he had to be at a wedding, so that's where he is. I have been interested in the Shroud of Turin for many years. I remember years ago reading an article in the Magnificat, very simple article on quantum mechanics or quantum physics. And I'm not a scientist, but the new science of quantum physics brings our cells down to the tiniest of specks. Indeed, one of the authors I was reading said that it is something that can prove the human soul. Quantum physics can actually prove the human soul. And the man that I was reading in the Magnificat, in fact I did a homily on it, said that this image that we see here, and what you're seeing here, the bottom image is a photograph of the actual shroud. The upper part took it through the process, and you can see in the top image, it's much more easy to see the body of Christ. The shroud is roughly 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. And you'll see another photograph, they actually wrapped it around his head. So it was under him and over him. And they also had a second cloth that covered his face underneath the shroud, and that's the cross. So that remained on him. It has a different kind of blood. When you're, just having died, your blood is very different from when you're dead for a period of time. The blood on the shroud, which we'll see, is unique. And scientists can say, well, that's blood. This person has been dead for a while, and this blood that still continued to seep out of his body made blood marks on the shroud. So it's an image of a crucified man that has become a very popular Catholic icon. For some, it is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ. For others, it is a religious icon reflecting the story of Christ, not necessarily the original. So there is controversy among some scientists. And the controversy is not, I believe it, and therefore I'm a Christian. I believe that it's authentic, but they don't believe in the resurrection. So they believe that, yes, it's authentic, it's from the 1st century, but I still don't believe in the resurrection. It shows me as a scientist that there was a man who died, and it most certainly is Christ, because 2 or 3 historians at the time, not to mention the Gospels, actually reported it. And one of them was a Roman historian, and he said, yes, Jesus Christ was crucified, he did die, and he writes about that when he's talking about the Emperor Nero. And that's where the persecution of Christians first began. In the 2nd century, they started to persecute Christians because of this pompous little emperor named Nero, a young man. He was terrible. He tried to burn part of Rome, and because it was the ugly part, so he was going to burn that and put up beautiful buildings in honor of himself, but instead he burned most of Rome. And of course the Romans were very upset, so he said, oh, it's those Christians, they're the ones that did it. No, they were the ones that did it, but their numbers were growing even in Rome and around the Mediterranean basin. Their numbers were growing, especially in Rome. And so he blamed them. But at any rate, this shroud came out about the year 1532, or 1332, excuse me. It started to, people became aware of it. And it was in a place in France, a little town called Turin. And there was a French knight named Geoffrey Deschardins who owned it in this little town, and it was kept in that town for a period of time. And then when he died, it made its way to another French town and stayed there briefly until it went to Turin, which was at the time not Italy, but of course it became Italy. This is the 14th century, in 1332 to 1350. From there it went to Turin, Italy. And so that's what a lot of scientists say, well, it's fake. Some medieval artist made this fake picture. And so there was a controversy from that time on. And they said, besides, it never appeared before 1332, so it must be fake. Well, over the period of years, scientists realized that by studying it, they brought in all kinds of scientists to decide where did it come from, when did it come from there. And they realized that at first it went to Edessa, which is in present-day Turkey, and that was one of the very strong Christian strongholds, Edessa. So it's right up where Turkey is, and right in that Mediterranean basin. Indeed, St. Paul traveled through Edessa a number of times. If you look at his routes going around from Rome all the way back down to Palestine, it's very typical that that would be part of a great Christian city. And then later on they found that through a writing, an extra canonical writing, not a gospel, that one of the apostles actually took this special burial cloth and brought it up to Edessa, to a king, the king of Edessa, who was ailing. And he was very proud. Can't see a lot of that. You can see a little bit, but they had drawn an image that was very different from the one that's actually on the shroud. There is a picture of the shroud from kind of a perspective, and you can see an even better view of Christ with his hands folded and with his thumbs not visible. It shows the nail marks going through the wrist. And interestingly enough, it shows the feet sideways, so the nail went through the ankle and then through the other foot instead of through the top, went through the ankle. And that's all obvious on this beautiful shroud. And there's a close-up of the face. Now you can see these marks. The places where the shroud was kept, two different times, one in the 1500s and then one later on in, what was it? I think it was the 1900s. The cathedral's burned, and it was kept in a box in the 1300s. It was kept in a silver box, and as the fire hit that box, some silver dripped down, and you can see the marks where it was burned. It was folded, and so it dripped and it burned the fold. So as you fold it out, you can see all the burn marks all the way through. So it was folded and folded. And that's how it ended up being burned. And that's important because these arguments that these scientists keep having eventually led to a carbon dating test. That was in the year 1988. There's another picture of the image, and you can see the burn marks even better in that one. There's also fold marks. So there are fold marks here and here, And it's how they folded it, and it started to wear in the folded parts. It is pure linen. And let's see, what else do I have here? You have to forgive me. Like I said, he told me last night at about 8:30. So none of this existed before then. Yes, another important point. Because of the disagreements, the Pope at that time, Pope Clement VIII, I believe, was the Avignon Pope. He was the Pope in France. There were a couple of popes, and eventually 3. Someone in power convinced him to declare this a fraud. So from the beginning, there were people saying, that's a fraud. Somebody painted it. Well, we'll find out more about that. Okay, these are blood marks, and this is the front. So of this image, there is no paint, there's no dye. That image, the Sea of Christ, I will get to that shortly, but there is blood. That's the only thing that's in the cloth. The image is not made of any pigment or anything, but the blood is a real substance. And you can see all these marks, obviously the scourging, right? And if you've seen the Passion of the Christ and you've watched the scourging, I encourage you to do that. That was based on the dolorous passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was a book written, was it the nun that wrote that? Anne Catherine, a German nun. She wrote that. And the scourging is particularly bad. I used to show it to our 7th graders during Lent. Yes?
She didn't write, she wasn't an author, she was a visionary. She wrote it through...
She dictated it to an author.
visions.
But it long before the show, it was a beautiful book that a lot of people would read during Lent. And so that movie was taken from that. And if you watch the scourging, when I told 7th graders got real nervous, and I didn't even ask their parents. God bless them. They would get upset, and I would say, this is horrible, and that's why we need to watch it, to understand the sacrifice that this God, man, made for us. So important for us to really feel that and see it. But I said, if you want, when you can't stand to look at it, just put your head down. Don't look at it. But in that, when they started flogging him, it was brutal. It was almost more brutal than the crucifixion was horrible. But the flogging was so brutal. They just kept hitting him. And the Roman soldier came down, the one who was in charge, and came in where they were scourging him and looked at him and said, I said to scourge him, not kill him. And he got real angry at the guys because they were going overboard with it. Well, that is what he looked like. He had blood, open flesh, all the way over his whole body. And you can see it on his calves and on his hands. And you can see the nail mark there on his hand and on his feet. And then all these scourgings. And one scientist went so far as to get that, some people call it cat of 9 tails, but it's a leather whip, and it's got little metal tubes tied into it. And as they hit him, they held it up there. If you see any of these, the films on it are exquisite. But they held one of those barrels up to these marks, and it was identical. And that, for us, is a gift, because we're getting to see that's something that Jesus Christ wanted us to have. And this is an image of what I really looked like. And indeed, when people die and come back, they will report the same thing. I indeed myself died, and I met him. And he looked just like the image and the face of the shrine. There is the back view. You can see the blood on his foot, how his back, his head, crown of thorns. His head, feet, blood. And of course, all the many scourgings that he suffered. Now, this is an image from Edessa, and you can see how they drew kind of crudely. They didn't have a real good way to look at the image. So they knew it was an image of a man, and so he's got his hands in front, but feet are separated, and they just kind of did the best they could. And it shows, the artist says, this is what we had here. And that's how we know that it was in Odessa, and also some documents that stated that. And here is a picture that an artist painted showing how the shroud fit over Jesus. And you see the Mother of God there, and you see some of his apostles, and the fellow over on the left with the turban, probably Joseph, whose tomb it was. Now, another interesting thing about the shroud when it was actually in Liry, which is where it began, Liry, France. Descharnais was the man who owned it, and he died in battle. And his granddaughter actually sold it and was immediately excommunicated. And they went to the person who bought it, and he said he would return it, but Margaret Descharnais was the one who sold it. One of the other things that they found was during certain photographic processes, they could actually show a 3D image. The shrine itself, I don't have a picture of it. So what they've done is they've started using that to build statues of how he looked. And you can see that rigor mortis had set in, and his knees had that bend in them from being on that cross for 3 hours. They did have also a what do they call him? I want to say undertaker. It's the individual that tests dead bodies. What is that called? Coroner. They did have a coroner who was very bright, who'd done probably 2,500 bodies, and so he actually looked at this and he described how the arms, because of the way the blood was on, were actually at about this degree. And he gave a very, very good description of everything just based on the actual shroud. But they did start making statues out of it, and this is one of those statues. And it was very interesting to see that this statue, they actually went as far as to paint what the scourging might have looked like. Close-up of the face here. It is the shroud. It's the negative. It's not the positive. And they do have public displays. And you can here's some clergymen in Turin that are observing the shroud. It's kept in some people say a bomb-proof container now, certainly bulletproof. And the early part of the last century, or the middle part, when there was another fire in Turin, they didn't have bulletproof glass. And I actually saw a video of the firemen in there pounding on the glass to try to take the shroud out before it was burned up with risk, because it was in the middle of a fire. And so these brave firemen went in and were able to break the glass. I thought, well, what if it was unbreakable glass and there was a fire? But I assume it's fireproof as well. So there it is, and they usually have a cloth hanging over it to cover it, and then they will remove that cloth at certain times and allow people in. And very frequently they have scientists come in and take photos of it and examine it, look at it, not necessarily touch it. They were able in 1988 to go in and take a very small corner of the shroud and to give it a carbon-14, it's a dating measurement, and they decided, carbon-14 said it was done in the 1300s, back when it was first obvious. And there are many other scientists that said, wait a minute, people were handling that over the years. People's hands, and there is dust on our hands. Indeed, there's dust on the shroud. And in that dust are very, very tiny spores. And those spores could come from things that we've touched, from our clothing. They're very infinitesimal. They're very tiny. And they come from plants, and they float in the air. So if you're touching the shroud with some kind of plant from the 1500s, and by the way, the corners were torn, so some nuns before that actually sewed new cloth in on the corners. So they weren't even taking pictures, they weren't taking a sample that was legitimate. They're taking a piece of new cloth. And I was reading a book last night and this morning about this gentleman who's very thorough. And he said, what did he call it? The chaos of the dating process in 1988. The scientists, as you may or may not know, they have a theory. And so they will start out to do their test to prove the theory. Not to prove the truth, but to prove the theory. And so they're saying, well, you're out there to prove your theory. You're not out there to give us the truth of where this beautiful sacred object came from. And so, there's constant arguments about it. And there are people, especially atheists and agnostics, who absolutely believe that it was a forgery. It was done in the 1300s. Some artist did it. However, there are many, many others who are experts in different fields. I mean, they have experts. One woman that I was watching a video of, she is an expert in the field of fabric and cloth throughout history. And she looked at the cloth, and she said, this cloth existed in Palestine, and there's a strip sewed on it. There's a strip. And there's a doctor, a scientist in Colorado, who has an enormous lab, and he's got a full picture of this photograph hanging in his lab, and he does many, many tests. And so he was very interested in that, and so he took a piece of cloth the same length and shape as the one that is on the shroud, and then he put the shroud around he has a figure there that he works with. He put it around the figure, and he tied that strip around the feet and around the body, and then around the neck, and tied it. He said that's when John, in his gospel, is talking about the cloths. He's talking about the shroud, the wrapping device, and also the facial. I mentioned earlier, I don't remember the name specifically, but they had a face cloth, and that also has an imprint on it. It is not kept there, and there is a full record of that face cloth from the time of Christ. Pretty identical. It's pretty reasonable that it would be the shroud from that time. Now, when you are a Christian, Catholic, or a denomination, you don't have to have all this stuff to prove that. You simply are in awe that Jesus Christ loves us so. And what did he say last week? Thomas wasn't there. And Thomas said, I'm not going to believe it. And when he finally had to put his hands on his side, he said, blessed are those who do not believe and do not see. Well, now, because we believe and we did not see, we are allowed to see. We're allowed to see the Shroud of Turin. We're allowed to see what he looked like. We're allowed to see all the damage that they did to his physical body. We're allowed to see that he was a human being who suffered terribly to show us how much he loves us. I mean, it's profound to be able to, especially to go before the Blessed Sacrament, if you do that, and just think about that, or even have an image of that shroud, just to look at it and think about it. Now, there are more things about the shroud. If you have, anybody here have formed.org? Formed.org has 2 or 3, if you've seen them, beautiful. They're so excellent documentaries on the shroud. They just explain tons. And they're very well worth it because they're very convincing. And you watch these scientists and you think, who is this man? Who is this woman? But this is what she does. She studies cloth throughout the ages. And another woman studies spores. And when the little tiny, and she studies spores, and she went in and she looked at those spores, and you have to look under a microscope because they're as tiny as the thread that makes up the yarn that made the linen. They're that tiny. And she started to take them out and examine them, and she placed some in Turin, some in Luri, and some in the other, I don't remember the other city in France, and some in Palestine, lo and behold, and some up in Edessa. She found spores from everywhere, including Palestine. And some of those spores, like the ones in Palestine, are not found anywhere else. They are native to the Palestinian area. That's where they exist, nowhere else. So, like many of the other things that we hear about and read about or see, it just continues to give us all kinds of new evidence that this is really Jesus Christ we're looking at. And because we believed, although we didn't see, we get to see. So during this retreat, it's called Resurrection Retreat. This was what Father Sam asked me to talk about. This idea that we have something from the resurrection. Now, I want to go back to the movie, The Passion of the Christ. Father James, the founder of SOLT, was there, and he was an advisor to Mel Gibson, who directed it and was one of the producers. And Mel, according to Father Sam, was having difficulty with the resurrection. It was a brief scene. And Father Jim said, he rose. He rose. And so when you see the end, you see the shroud floating down and Jesus standing up, walking out. When I started this talk, I talked about quantum physics. And if you look at the edge of the cloth, the image is on the very surface of the cloth. It's thin, right? But it's just the very surface of the cloth that has the image on it, the part that was touching Jesus. And this fellow that talked about this idea of quantum physics says, when that body became supernatural, which is and he described it a lot more thoroughly than I can even remember. It's at home in my library, so I wasn't able to access that. But he said, as Christ went through the shroud, his supernatural body, his supranatural body, left that image. Not ink, not dye, they've studied it. It is nothing they can find. He simply left an image on every tiny little thread and particle in us. And with him having this supernatural body, was able to float through and leave that image just exactly where he wanted to. And boy, what chaos he has provided. I have people come to me a lot as a deacon. Deacon, I'm having so much trouble with my kids. My brother hates me because I go to church. People will hate you because of me. And the shroud, we're living the gospel. The shroud is like that. Certain people they just hate it. They want to disprove it. There's an atheist at this man that I was reading. Couldn't finish his book. It takes 10 hours to read. I'd be here in my pajamas reading it still. Anyway, he keeps talking about. Let's see if I can get the guy's name. It's good to know. It's a current. He calls himself the best atheist, or the greatest atheist, and he's the one who tries to dispute this, and the author is constantly talking about him. Richard Dawkins, Englishman. And you can look him up. He's a well-known atheist. I do not understand this. I have a belief in Jesus Christ. You have a belief in Jesus Christ. Somebody out there, they don't have a belief in him. Maybe they're agnostic. I won't believe it unless somebody proves it to me. Or maybe they're an atheist. I hate the idea of God. There is no such thing. You're all crazy. And that's what some of these atheists, it's like, well, leave me alone. But not Dawkins and other people like him. We're going to disprove every sacred piece of art. We're going to disprove the Holy Eucharist. We're going to disprove this and that. And, you're going to find that. And it's like I said, people will hate you because of me. It's in the gospel. If you are hated by someone, you are living the gospel. You're hated because of your faith. You're living the gospel. I tell that to people who are suffering because it's a consolation. It's like united with the suffering of Jesus Christ and for the salvation of a brother or sister or a nephew or a niece or a child. Do that. Now, there's one other thing, and I brought it to my attention. The blood that is, if I can go back, the blood was tested, and it is AB positive, right?
Again, like the Eucharistic miracle.
Yes, just like Eucharistic miracles, like the facial cloth. Yeah, it's all AB positive. What is AB positive? Universal donor. Universal donor.
Universal receiver. Universal receiver.
He's donating.
The number is O. AB is universal receiver. I'm AB. We.
Oh, I thought you said it was a. Oh, well, that changes everything.
Universal receiver. I will draw all people to myself when I am ready.
I'll receive your blood. Okay, I get that.
Universal receiver.
So Jesus' blood has always been AB.
Yes.
AB positive, yep. Everything that they've tested, the miracle in Portugal, where is that miracle?
Santarem.
Santarem.
143 of them.
Yeah.
There's
There's some.
133.
There's one in eastern Italy that I've actually seen, and
Lanciano.
that's Lanciano. And as you're walking down this narrow street, it's like that's a church? You can't tell because the buildings are kind of squished together. And as you walk in there, we went there, what year did we go there? It was 15, 20 years ago maybe. And we walked in where they had the crystal, and they had the blood and the flesh. And I was this close, looking at it. Just looking at it. And everybody was. They walked right up behind the altar, right? And you could walk right up to it. People were nice enough not to touch it, but you could get right up next to that crystal and take a look at it. So if you ever go to eastern Italy, it's right on the other side from Rome, a little bit higher. So it'd be possible. Not. It would have been great if it was a universal donor, but it's a universal receiver
I will draw all people to myself when I'm raised up.
through my blood.
Yeah.
So that's all that I have. I can answer any questions if you have any. Yeah.
Where does our church stand right now? I noticed.
There's some priests that don't accept it, and there's some that do, just like everybody else. There's going to be Catholics and Christians that don't accept it, and some that do. Like any image, Medjugorje, not yet. I'm sorry? She's still receiving messages. So until they're done, the church doesn't.
Veronica's veil.
Yes, Veronica's veil. I don't know where that is.
It's somewhere, I know.
Yeah, I'm sure. I know, and keep referring to the Passion of Christ, but it was so beautiful because this tiny little woman, Veronica, her little girl's crying, and so she goes down to Jesus as he's laying on the ground after falling, and everybody's fighting and fist fights, and she just glides right through, just like nothing, through all these people fighting, and she takes her cloth and puts it up to his face, and he looks up at her. And then as she's standing there holding it, you can see the image of his face that he left imprinted on that veil for her. So we have these wonderful things, but certainly the most amazing one that we have is the shroud, and that is the one that's many, many, many tens of thousands of people have seen through the beauty of photography. It started in here we are, 120 years.
Feast day for it, Julie?
No,
It's like
no, I don't believe the church has made that. I'm sure there are popes and priests and other bishops that believe it, but it's a sacred image also. So it's for those who want to believe it. The church does make declarations of certain things. Fatima, Lourdes, Knox. Yes?
The Veronica's veil is in the Matilda Chapel at the Vatican.
Oh, there you go. It's in the Vatican.
Can you repeat that for the mic?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat that, what you just said?
It's in the Matilda Chapel in the Vatican, in Vatican City.
Does it match the image of Jesus?
Does it match the image of
The face?
the shroud? Why don't you come up here?
Yes,
I just looked it up, that's all.
Well, do you have any information?
It just says that it's in a frame.
It's in a frame. It's protected.
It's in a frame.
Okay, so we have at least those three different artifacts. We have the shroud, which is two pieces. We have the facial cloth that went over his whole head is another artifact, and then of course Veronica's veil. So those things are there, but we're not going to maybe see as much of the other two as we see of this. Yeah. We won't see as much because this is since the 1980s. There have been well over 1,000 hours of scientific study of this in several different places throughout the world.
What's it going to take?
It's a gift.
It is a gift.
It's a gift for those who see it and those who believe. What did Bishop Sheen say? For those, maybe it wasn't him, for those who believe, for those who do not believe, there can be no evidence. For those who believe, there need not be any evidence. And something like that, I'm paraphrasing. So, yeah, I don't think it's important that somehow, I mean, we can't convince everybody that Jesus Christ is in the Holy Eucharist. That's the ultimate. I mean, yeah. So I think the shroud is going to be second best, at least. Anything else? All right.
So the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, paint brush through snow.
Yeah. Another one, A Lady of Guadalupe. Have you ever been? I haven't been there. Father Sam told me about it. He said when you look up at the image, if you're under it, looking at it, it looks beautiful. And he said as you walk away, it gets bigger. When you walk closer, it gets smaller. So Mrs. Medley has a long history of giving really excellent talks on Our Lady of Guadalupe.
I have an hour and a half talk that I give on
Yeah. But we only have 5 minutes. If no.
This was awesome, Deacon. I can't thank you enough. I have been so interested in this and didn't know where to turn to look.
We'll go to forum. I read it and then it wouldn't download. I read a segment, you know, you can read a segment. And then it wouldn't download. I'm walking on the house, she said, calm down. I was like, wow. It won't download. Let's see, what is it called? Yeah, it's called The Coming from Christ. Let's see if I